Hey guys, it is finally fall, so today I have 3 healthy from scratch homemade meals for you guys to try out, as well as a fall dessert, which obviously isn't healthy, but it is still homemade and from scratch, and I wanted to share that with you guys. So the first meal we are making is inspired by a recipe that I found from Healthy Elizabeth on YouTube, and it is a squash and sausage bowl with rice. I'm pretty sure she just used butternut squash, but I wanted to try some acorn squash as well, so I have acorn squash here and butternut squash. The acorn squash was really hard to cut into, but my knife is also extremely dull. The butternut squash was not as hard, even though it might look like I'm struggling a little bit. It was definitely softer. I just cut them both into strips and then into cubes and tossed them all in a parchment-lined baking sheet, drizzled it with some avocado oil and olive oil. You can use whatever oil you want, and then seasoned it with some salt and pepper, garlic powder, and paprika. You may have noticed that I left the skins on the squash, which I didn't think you could do, but I just recently heard that you could, so I figured I would try it out and see how it turned out. While the squash is roasting at 400 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes, I started the rice. I added 2 cups of basmati rice to a pot along with 4 cups of water. If I had chicken broth, I would have used that, but I didn't. So I'm just seasoning it with some salt and garlic powder and butter. I put that over a pretty high heat and then just stir it occasionally until it starts to boil. And then I'll put it on low and add a lid on top and then cook that for about 15 minutes or until it looks ready. While I'm doing that, I took the casings off of some sausage and cooked it on a skillet to make ground sausage to put in our bowls. When the squash came out of the oven, it smelled so good and it tasted amazing all together in a bowl. The acorn squash's peel was a little bit thick for me, but the butternut squash you couldn't even tell at all. Overall, it was a very delicious, hearty fall meal, and I would definitely do it again. The next day, I started off my recipe by thawing some of my homemade chicken broth in some warm water to make this homemade sourdough stuffing. This recipe I got from Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone, and since Thanksgiving was coming up, I wanted to test out the recipe, so I figured we would just have it for supper. I took a bunch of leftover sourdough bread and it equaled up to around a pound of sourdough, cut them up into small cubes and tossed them with butter, baked them in the oven at 350 for about 20 minutes. And then while that was baking, I cut up some celery, 3 stalks of celery, and 1 medium onion. Then over medium heat, I melted some butter in a skillet and added the celery and onions. And I'm just sauteing those until they're nice and soft. So I actually have some sage and thyme in my garden, which is pretty exciting. One of those things that is actually pretty cool when you're cooking and you get to go in your garden and just pick the herbs that you want and use them right away. So that's really cool. While the onions and celery are cooking, I am chopping up some sage and thyme. I need about a tablespoon of both if it's fresh. If it's dried, about a teaspoon. I'm still new to using fresh herbs, so it made me really happy that I got to use my own grown herbs in this recipe. While I'm letting the onions and celery cook down a little bit more before I add the herbs, my chicken broth is nice and thawed now, so I added 3 cups to that to a bowl plus 2 eggs, and then just mixing that together until it's combined. The onions and celery were pretty much almost done, so I added the 2 teaspoons of salt plus all of the herbs that I just cut up, and a half teaspoon of pepper. And then when that mixture is cooked down a bit and nice and soft, I added that to the liquid mixture and then poured in the toasted sourdough crumbs and then made a huge mess out of it. But you want to coat the bread in the mixture and just let that sit for 10 minutes to absorb all of that liquid, and then add it to a casserole dish. And I had some leftover rabbit meat, so I'm going to add that to it, plus a can of corn. And then I'm just going to bake that at 350 for 25 to 30 minutes, or until it gets nice and golden brown. And then while that's cooking, we are making a gravy to go with it. So in a small saucepan, I just melted some butter, added a 1/3 cup of flour, and just mixed that together to form a roux, and then added a little bit of the chicken broth until it incorporated, and then just added the rest, and then continuously stirred it until it got a little bit thicker. It wasn't a super thick sauce, so I could have maybe used a little bit more flour, but it was still pretty good. And I added quite a bit of salt to it, and I should have tasted it before because it was pretty salty. Now, I've never made stuffing before, but even just the smell of it made me proud because it smelled like what stuffing is supposed to smell like, and it was really good. My husband ate it with the gravy, but I didn't because it was too salty for me. The next meal we are going to make is a pumpkin pasta. And for this recipe, I wanted to add some cottage cheese to it to make it creamy and have more protein. So we are making some homemade cottage cheese. I am putting 2 liters of milk in a small pot and then warming that up on a medium-low heat until it feels hot when you stick your finger in there. I took it off the heat and added 100 milliliters of vinegar and covered that with a lid and let that sit for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes was done, it didn't look like there was a lot of curds on there, so I added a little bit more vinegar and let that sit for another 20 minutes. And I'm not sure if it actually helped or not. But now I'm going to strain the cottage cheese. I put a strainer over a bowl and then added a cloth on top. And then I'm just straining the cottage cheese over it. Now, there is a lot of whey, so I had to empty it out and then made a huge mess, but then put the strainer back on the bowl so it wouldn't just sit in its own way, so it could strain off the whey and become a nice cottage cheese. So this is what the cottage cheese looked like after about 40 minutes, and it looks really good. I put it in a container and just set that aside in the fridge until I'm ready to use it later in the pasta. In the meantime, since it wasn't supper yet, I am going to be making the fall cookies that I told you guys about. The goal here is to make a chewy brown sugar pumpkin cookie. So I'm testing out some things to see if I can make that happen. So in a bowl, I melted 1 cup or 227 grams of salted butter, and then I added a teaspoon of vanilla, and then I'm going to be adding 1 egg plus an egg yolk. And the egg yolk is just supposed to give it a little bit more fat to help it be more chewy. I also saw a Half-Baked Harvest video where she used apple butter to make the cookies chewy. So I didn't have apple butter, but I did make an apple crisp syrup for coffee, and it was a little bit thick, so I added about 1/4 cup of that, plus 1 cup or 200 grams of light brown sugar, and then 1/4 cup of molasses. Now, some of the reason why pumpkin cookies are more cakey than normal is because there's a lot of liquid in the pumpkin puree. So I am taking 2/3 cup of pumpkin puree and putting that in a paper towel and then just pressing it and squeezing out the liquid. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but just to get a little bit more of the liquid out. Then I'm just mixing all of the liquid ingredients together and then adding my dry. So I used 375 grams, which is 3 cups of flour, a half teaspoon of baking soda, and a half teaspoon of baking powder, which I think I'm going to leave out next time. And for the spices, you could use a pumpkin pie spice, but I just used what I had. So I had 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of ginger, and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. The dough was a little bit sticky at first, but that was what I was expecting, and it did firm up a little bit for the second and third batches. So I baked the first batch at 375 degrees for about 12 minutes, but they did come out a little bit cakey, so I wanted to bake them a little bit less for the second and third trays. I also decided to make a glaze to drizzle on top, and I thought a coffee flavored glaze would be really good. So I took some melted butter, added some icing sugar, and then about 2 tablespoons of espresso, and then just kind of mixed that together until it got a nice smooth consistency. And I did have to warm it up a little bit to get everything incorporated nicely and then add a little bit more icing sugar, but then it ended up being perfect. These cookies look amazing. These ones especially look the best. This is the one I did last. So the first batch, the dough was very soft, and I baked them at 375 degrees for this one. I think I did about 12-ish minutes, and they started to like crack at the top, which was like that crinkly texture that I was looking for, but they didn't deflate like I was looking for. I wanted them to spread more like and be a chewy cookie. They're not. They're still pretty cakey, but still very good. That coffee glaze is really good. This was the second batch. I only baked this for about 9 minutes. They kind of look the same. They're still cakey. They're pretty much the same. But these ones I only baked for 8 minutes. They did deflate a little bit after being at room temperature, taking them out of the oven for a while. And so they honestly look the best because they look like more of like that chewy cookie look. But let's see. They are definitely more underbaked. Let's try it. I think I definitely like these ones the best. Yeah. And I think if you freeze them and have them a little bit underbaked like this, taking them right out of the freezer and just eating like that would be really, really good. And this coffee glaze is so good with the pumpkin flavor. And these ones I put a little bit of salt on top too. Oh, it's just so good. I'm gonna experiment a little bit more with them though, because obviously didn't want a cakey cookie. So we'll see. They're still pretty good though. So now it's time to make that pumpkin pasta. So I started it off by sauteing some onions in some butter, and then I just cooked my pasta. I'm just using a spaghetti pasta, but you can use whatever type of pasta you like. Now to make the sauce, I'm putting a cup of pumpkin puree into a blender cup and a cup of that homemade cottage cheese that I made earlier. Now, you can use a real pumpkin and cut it up and roast it if you want to. And then for the seasonings, I added a teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of pepper, and a quarter teaspoon of nutmeg, and then a teaspoon of paprika. And when the onions were all nice and golden and soft and cooked down, I added that as well, plus a little bit of the pasta water. And since my blender isn't the greatest, I had to actually add quite a bit more pasta water than what you saw there until it was able to blend nicely. After everything was blended nice, I added that back into the skillet, added more pasta water, and then the pasta itself. Then just mix that together to coat the pasta with the sauce. And honestly, this was one of my favorite recipes. It was so creamy and like kind of like a mac and cheese, but with hidden veggies. So it was really good. And I topped it off with some red chili flakes. I love trying out new recipes, and I especially love it when the recipes I try turn out really good. And all 3 of these recipes I really love, and I'm probably going to keep on making them throughout the fall because they're so good and they just taste so much like fall. And the cookies too, obviously. But I hope this also gave you some good ideas of some homemade healthy meals that you can make for your family during the fall. Or I hope it at least just inspired you to be creative and come up with your own recipes and know that you can make food from home, from scratch, and it doesn't have to be super difficult. Definitely let me know if you guys try any of these recipes and what you might have changed or what you liked about it. And if you like these types of videos, please let me know so I can continue making them, because I do enjoy filming the process and getting them out to you guys. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next week.